Dr. Schultz, it's a pleasure to have you on our program again. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Let's briefly review some of the very public, unprecedented chaos in the U.S. Congress in 2023, particularly in the House.
Right.
What stood out for you?
Two things stood out to me. One of them is the constant churning over selecting initially a Speaker of the House way back, ancient history of January of 2023, and then the ouster of the Speaker of the House, and then the churning to select a new Speaker of the House. And in some sense, these are threads that connect each other by roughly 10 months. Is that the factors that led to McCarthy's rise and fall are the factors that led to the rise and fall of several candidates and eventually the selection of the new speaker. So that would stand out. The second thing that stands out to me, we can do more detail in both of them. Only the sixth time in American history, the House ousted a member from Congress.
Yeah.
Those are the two things that at a mega level that really, there's a lot of other stuff, but let's start with those.
I want to go to the ouster of Congressman Santos. You're not only a historian, but you also have experience with law, obviously, ample experience. What do you think from a legal level? When I look at this, and this is not a political comment, this is a legal comment, I
Right.
sort of think like, well, should he not have some sort of legal proceeding determine the outcome of his, guilt or innocence? And from a political
Right.
perspective, when I think of it, is, well, what if members of Congress in another context gang up against another representative? There's some charges, and even though that representative is duly voted in by the members of his or her own constituent, now they kick that member out. Does this trouble you?
But potentially it does, because let's think about where I am located. I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota,
Yeah.
across the river from Minneapolis. There's a Congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, who has made lots of controversial statements about Israel, depending on your perspective.
Yeah.
Controversial statements about the Palestinians, but very sharply critical of U.S. foreign policy and support for Israel. Could there be a possibility that at some point let us say a Republican majority, and she's a Democrat, by the way, a
Yeah.
Republican majority is so incensed by her and says they're going to oust her. They're going to oust her and say she's engaging in actions unbecoming a member of Congress and toss her out.
Even though her constituents may still want her there, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
She won by well in excess of 60% of the popular vote in the last election. She has one of the most secure Democratic seats, and I'll just say one of the most secure congressional seats in the country at this
Wow.
point. Yeah. So on one level, it does concern me, but on the other level, we have to think in a couple of different directions here. One of them is the fact that the Constitution, for good or for bad, does give to Congress the broad authority to determine the fitness and qualifications of its members. And there's something on one level that I'm happy about with the Santos decision,
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't wait for a criminal conviction. They said that our standard of conduct is not, have you been convicted of a crime? It is some higher ethical standard in terms of again, bringing disrepute to Congress. And if we're thinking in terms
Sort of
of
a higher standard.
a higher standard,
Yeah.
yes. If we're thinking in terms of saying, do we expect our elected officials merely to, as I call it, skim the surface of the law to say, I haven't been convicted yet. I haven't done anything that a court of law has said wrong. I'm not sure with regular citizens or with members of Congress, I would consider that to be ethical behavior. So I'm pleased to see on one level
Yeah.
that they did this. But remember, it's only the sixth person in the House of Representatives. The last time this happened was in the 1980s, I believe it was. It was Representative Traficant, who was actually convicted of a crime. This case with Santos, he's the first member ever not to have been convicted of a crime or not associated with expulsions surrounding the Civil War. Because after the Civil War, we had in 1860, when the South seceded from the Union, we
Yeah.
had a large number of senators from the South and a fair number of House members from the South who went with the Confederacy, and for obvious reasons, they were expelled from
Yeah.
Congress at this
Yeah.
point. So this is an unusual move that does cut potentially a couple of ways.
But in this case, I do agree with you. Santos's case was just so egregious. But you see, my question was a bit academic, but it may
Right.
have real political ramifications
Of
down the
course it
line.
does.
And the example that you brought up regarding
Right.
Representative
And yeah, the other thing I should say, the other thing I
Ilhan.
should say, yeah, the other thing I should say that was good here, it was the Republican-led House that ousted one of their own Republicans. I would be even more concerned had this been a Democratic Party-controlled House that ousted him. I still think, based on everything I've read, Santos deserved to be ousted from Congress.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but here you can at least say that you didn't have the partisan dimension, in the sense that this really is the Republicans policing themselves. And that you've got to give at least some bonus points
Of
to,
course,
in
that's a
terms of,
positive precedent, actually.
I think that's wonderful. I mean, we actually had bipartisan agreement here that his behavior was so egregious that he deserves to be ousted. Now, to me, my only concern is the fact that this should have probably happened earlier, but I can understand they went through, they had an ethics report that the House put together. They actually did some institutional due process. And once they reached their own conclusion that he had engaged in behavior that raised serious ethical issues, they moved relatively quickly to oust
Yeah.
him.
Yeah. There are many different things and details and factors we can go into about Congress in 2023. What I'm wondering is, taking a grand view of Congress this past year and the chaos, is there another period in American history that resonates with this? I can think of the period before the Civil War, the period maybe in the 1870s. I don't know, maybe the 1920s during Prohibition. What are your thoughts on this? Have we had
No,
another? Go ahead. Go
yeah,
ahead.
no, I was going to say is that for so many years, by the way, okay, so for many years, I give a lot of community talks, and it's sort of funny. I can almost picture this. I'll give a community talk and somebody will start by coming to me and they'll be wringing their hands or pulling their hair saying, "Isn't it the most polarized we've ever been in American history?" And I'll say, "Well, hell, the Civil War really beats the heck out of this." And want to
Yeah.
say that there
Yeah.
is no comparison. But I have to say right now, we are starting to get to that point in terms of a comparison to the
Really?
Civil War. Because, even in, let's say, the 1920s, uh, if we're really looking at a conflict that's going on, it's not within Congress, it is Congress and the courts, or the 1920s and 1930s. The Supreme Court and Congress are viewing things differently. And it's really, I think, the churning that happens with the Civil War, the succession from the Union, again, we talked about it before, the expulsions, and then maybe post-Civil War, the Reconstruction. So we're really into an area now that's very unique. In my American politics class at Hamline University, where I teach, there's this wonderful little book that I use. It's called A Brief Introduction to American Political History by Donald Critchlow. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I'm not selling the book. I have no royalties in this one. But one of the things that he wants to point out is how, problems that we see today have antecedents throughout American history. Like we think that it's unique today that we have polarization or that we have party conflict. And he's saying, guess what? We've always had this. These are unresolved problems, but here it is unique. And if I look at some measures, I can point to some things that really put us, let's say, at least in the last half century, that make us unique.
Hmm.
And if I were to go back, let's say approximately 50 years, let's say mid 70s, mid
Yeah.
70s at this
Yeah.
point. And if we were to look at votes in Congress, first, that we would find that the vast majority of the votes in Congress were bipartisan. And that's a good measure, at least for most of us who would say. And unless we subscribe to the theory that the government that governs the least governs the best, and there are some who might say that, the productivity in Congress was actually quite good. A lot of bills were passed, a lot of critical legislation adopted bipartisanly, and there were very few filibusters. By
This sounds
comparison,
great.
sounds great. It was
Yeah.
it was a great period actually in American history. Remember, Republicans and Democrats got together to oust Nixon. I still remember this scene. There's this scene I saw
Yeah.
in a video recently of Senator Howard Baker, who's a Republican in the Senate. And I can't remember what talk show he was back on in the 70s. And one of the talk show hosts is, again, practically frenetic, saying, Nixon's going to get away with it. Nixon's going to get away with it. And Howard Baker, Republican senator from Tennessee, pats this person's hand and says, don't worry, we're going to get Nixon. And you watch that and you think, oh my God, this is incredible. Okay, so now
And Baker,
forward
it was
us.
it was a Republican, obviously.
It was a Republican
Yeah,
who
yeah,
Republicans say we're going to get a Republican president
yeah.
because he's abusing his authority. Now get us to the last, let's say, 3 to 4 years. The percentage of legislation that's bipartisan is very low. The vast majority is straight party line. That means one party's voting for it. Essentially, no minority party voting for it. The percentage of filibusters or threatened filibusters is way up, and the amount of legislation adopted by some measures takes us back to the 1940s in terms of the amount. And I say that because in the early 1940s, mid 1940s, the country's preoccupied with World War II. It's not doing a lot of legislating.
Yeah.
It's outside of what? Allocating money for the armies at this point. So, or another way of looking at it is that in the 1970s, again, by measuring votes, we could see an ideological overlap between the Democrats and Republicans. Now, in voting behavior, the most liberal voting Republicans, his or her record is still more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. There's no ideological overlap between the
Wow.
parties.
Wow. We're going to talk more about politics of populism and Trump in the subsequent segments. But before we go there, I had a comment to make and a question to ask. My comment, subject to your sort of correction, confirmation, is that you mentioned filibuster several times. As I see it, going back to history, filibusters have become much easier. Before, you had the speaking filibusters where you had to be on the floor. You had to be there sometimes 2, 3 days. It was
Right.
famous, the ones, the Southern senators, when they filibustered in the civil rights movement, they were
Right.
literally there. But now it's not like that anymore. Now you sort of announce it and you don't have to be on the Senate well anymore, right?
You're
Speak.
absolutely correct. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. The image that most people have, if you Google an old movie, Mr. Smith Goes to
that's
Washington.
right. That's
That's right.
yeah.
And you have
Cary Grant. Yeah,
I think it's Cary Grant, if I remember
yeah,
correctly.
yeah.
And he's been talking so long, he's hoarse. He can't even get his voice out anymore. And that was pretty accurate. In the old days, you couldn't take bathroom breaks or anything like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
there's we won't go into the legendary stories about what people wore during the filibuster, but you're
Uh,
right. You physically had to be there. And also another thing you couldn't do, you couldn't lean on something. You couldn't prop yourself up by, let's say, putting your hand on a table or something. You had to be fully erect, standing up doing
wow.
the filibuster. Now you merely have to threaten and say, I'm going to filibuster it. And that acts as a way of basically stopping
Yeah.
the debate on that legislation.
You
Now,
know,
I was going to say, the old-fashioned filibusters stopped everything, though. They stopped all the movement on the floor for legislating. On one level, these filibusters now are a little bit more narrow, but still, it
wait,
doesn't.
explain that. I don't appreciate the difference. What do you mean they're
Okay,
more narrow?
okay, okay. The old filibusters would stop all the work in the Senate,
Okay,
everything,
yeah, yeah,
everything.
yeah.
Now you can filibuster a particular piece of legislation.
Oh, so, sort of like a topic-based, subject-based filibuster.
Yes, yes, yes.
Oh, I see. I see. That's interesting. I did not appreciate that difference. What are
Yeah.
the things from a political perspective? I mean, you explained the physical strain on the filibustering senator, but from a political perspective, people would, well, back then, newspapers, they would read about it, I guess, more than see you on TV. But you had to politically put yourself out there by essentially stopping everything that the Senate does. Now, the political costs of filibusters are arguably a little bit less because you're not in front of people on C-SPAN for 3 days stopping the nation's business.
You're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Although we'll tell a kind of a funny story though about one filibuster a few years ago, and I can't even remember what the topic was, but Senator Ted Cruz from Texas decided to filibuster, and he actually decided to do a real filibuster,
Oh,
right?
wow.
Um,
Okay.
which is really quite rare to actually. So, and it's on C-SPAN, by the way. And it got to be evening, and he generally reads his children a bedtime story, before they go to bed, like
Yeah,
many
yeah,
parents.
yeah.
And so part of his filibuster was reading Green Eggs and Ham from the floor of the House of Representatives. And whatever you may think of Ted Cruz, good, bad, ugly, in between, uh, it was kind of humorous to watch because some of the old filibusters, they would do things like that. They would read from the Bible or they would read the Constitution,
Or a
because
cookbook.
or a cookbook. Yeah, you
Yeah.
didn't actually have to keep talking about the legislation, as long as you kept talking or something like that. So America heard Green Eggs and Ham,
I love it.
at a young child's bedtime.
I will have to Google that, go on YouTube. One final question here. I told you I have a comment and a question, so here's
Right.
the question. We were talking about Santos, and we talked about the sort of the legislative due process he had with the ethics committee, and then you mentioned standard of conduct.
Right.
We expect our legislatures, national legislatures, to have a higher standard of sort of ethics than being merely not being criminals. So let's talk about decorum and statesmanship. It seems to be fading, at least in the House of Representatives.
Right.
Is it a case that we have always had it and now we're losing it? Or is it the case that it's been the same? It's just that in the past we had stronger leaders in Congress who prevented crazy representatives or senators from doing crazy stuff. What do
Yeah,
you
I,
think?
I, yeah, I mean, we obviously have had some crazy things happen throughout American history. I mean,
Yeah.
we've had an occasional but very, very rare, um, fist fights or altercations, in the House of Representatives. But these are incredibly rare situations.
Yeah.
But you're generally right. It's a combination of the fact that the leadership, uh, was much stronger, and if I can use the word, sat on members, and basically sort of you're not going to do certain things. But there also was the sense in which, for a lot of the members, was that greater respect for decorum. But I think one of the things that has changed, both positive and negative, is the, broadcasting of Congress. Good in the sense
Oh,
that
yeah.
good in a sense that we get to see them doing the people's business, and that's good. That's really, really good. But on the other hand, I think there's more, hamming to the camera. There's much more playing to the camera at this point, and some of this, I wonder now how much of it is that. I mean, there's this legendary story, takes us back to the 1980s when Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, he's, Democrat, and C-SPAN is first starting, and you would see these scenes where Republicans would get up and denounce, the leadership. They would denounce, Tip O'Neill or whatever it may be, or something like that. And one day, to the anger of Republicans, he asked C-SPAN, move the cameras back to pan to see what it looks like. And it showed these members of the House speaking to an empty chamber. Um, um, and what we're wondering now, again, how much now do we see people like, I don't know, we can range anywhere from Laura Bobet, Marjorie Taylor Greene, to
Yeah,
Matt
yeah,
Getz, to maybe a host of others at this point. I don't want to quite say, is this their Andy Warhol, 15 minutes of fame? But there is a little bit of that 15 minutes of fame there. And have to say that there are Democrats who do the same thing. I think Charles Schumer oftentimes has a very good sense of how to speak to the camera
yeah.
to get the reports, and so it's a bipartisan learning about how to use the camera.
Yeah. And another difference is that after you're done with that take, now that gets reposted and reposted and reposted and reposted on social media. We'll be back after a short break to talk about the hyper-masculine politics of Trumpism and why Taylor Swift is right about politics. We'll be right back.